We'll start recording. All right, cool. Let's go back to Substance Painter. All right, so to change the environment map, by default, it might be something else like Tomoko or Tacoma or Studio or something like that. But I want to use Panorama because that's what my that is what my VDev rig has, right? The closer you can match your VDev rig presentation to Substance Painter, the easier life is going to be. I'm going to use shadows, but you guys don't have to. I'm just going to keep them lightweight and just give a little bit. It just makes it look a little bit more realistic. But honestly, again, if your file is going slow, like mine might end up at some point, really don't worry about it. This down here is concerning me, right there. I do not know why it's like that. Probably because I changed my resolution. Okay, so I have my asset pulled into Substance Painter. I got my environment set up. I'm using ACES, so that's all looking good. If I screw up anything or grab the wrong file, I can always go up to Edit Project Configuration, select a different file, or change my normal map format, or change my color setup. So just keep that in mind if you screwed up anything. All right, so the first thing I need to do after setting up my environment is I'm going to go over here to my texture set settings. So this is where we're going to have essentially our shader channel. So it's telling me I have a base color, height, roughness, metallic, and normal channels. That's great. It's exactly what I want. I'm going to come down here to mesh maps. So we'll talk a little bit more about mesh maps later, but I'm going to go ahead and bake my mesh maps. So we're going to click on that button, and we can use the default settings down here. So the maps it creates. I will want to create a. I don't need a height map. I don't need a ID map either. But all the other ones, thickness, position, curvature, ambient occlusion, world space normal, and normal, those are all great. I recommend baking your mesh maps to be 4K. It might make your computer, it's going to take a little bit sometimes if you're on a slower computer, but it's worth it. If you have a high-res model you're bringing in, you might want to use a high-res model to bake your normal maps onto, but we're not going to worry about that either. So I'm just going to click on Bank Selected Textures. You'll see the process going. It should, okay, down here you can see it's showing a progress bar. So we'll just wait a second for that to happen. No, so baking mesh maps just gives us information about our model that our texture nodes can work with. So if you want to do edge detection, that's how Substance Painter knows what an edge is, right? Yeah, ambient occlusion, edge detection, curvature, thickness, position in the space. It creates a texture map that is being referenced by Substance Painter to do cool things like have top-down lighting or something like that, or do like rust on the inside of the model, right? Because otherwise it doesn't know what those things are. Okay, so we're going to click on Return to Painting Mode. It's funny, there's the baking menu. When you go to bake, it's a little croissant, and then you click on painting to go back to painting. All right, so you can see it created all these mesh maps. Right here in our viewport, we have right here, which is our viewer, like what mode we're viewing. So by default is the material. So you can come down and you can look at the channels, right? So there's also a button, if you press C, it's channel. So it's going through all my channels. If you press B, it's going through all your bake maps. So you can see my ambient occlusion map. That's what it looks like. Here's what my curvature map. You can see the edges are getting highlighted and the cavities are getting like darkened. I have position, which is like like position in the world. Thickness, which is how thick or deep an object is. I don't know why this one shows up. Oh, I know why this one's so thick. It's because this part's up here is hollow and this is solid. Oh, press B. Then height. In this case, I didn't need a height map or bent normals or opacity, but we also have a world space normals. Cool. So it just shows me all of my mesh maps came in correctly. And you can press M to go back to material. All right, so now let's go ahead and start building my material. The first thing I do is usually personally, I just go ahead and create a fill layer and start building it myself. But what we're going to do is to help speed us along, we're going to start from one of the original base meshes that are created by Substance Painter or provided by Substance Painter. So this is the asset library. If you can't see it, you just go to Window, Views, Assets, and just dock it to the side. You can hide it. I think you can just right click over here and just say Assets if you want more real estate. And this is where we're going to find like our smart masks. So you see there's a bunch of smart masks. We have a bunch of filters, we have paintbrushes, we have alphas, which are essentially image stamps. Then we have all our texture nodes, which are, we're going to be using this tab heavily. So anyways, looking back at my material, I have this kind of like terracotta pot that has like, well, it might even be copper, but I'm going to treat it kind of like just like almost like it's terracotta because it's so rusty that I don't see any metal. So I have this underlayer and this top layer. This top layer is probably like a patina, like oxidized, like crunchy layer. And then underneath it's also very crunchy, but it has different properties. Something else I'm noticing, especially on a grazing angle, you'll notice there's a specular difference, right? You see there's like some areas that get a little bit hotter on the reflection, so it tells me it's sharper in some areas and then duller in some areas. And I can see the general roughness of both of these layers. They're both very similar, but this one's like a little less irregular in its roughness, and this one up here is very regular. There's a lot of color information, so there's a lot of really cool color stuff I might represent, and there's also a lot of interesting bump and height stuff. So there's a lot of things I'm going to come back and look at and compare. Oh my God, I just sprayed everywhere. But yeah, so that's what I'm noticing first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for something that's like a little grungy, dirty, kind of scuffy, kind of original material. So we're going to go back to Substance Painter. I was looking through it earlier, and I kind of really like this clay terracotta material. So I'm going to take that, and I'm just going to drag it over into my layer stack. Okay. So immediately you can see that my material is now this like clay terracotta material. And if you want to rotate the light source, just hold shift and right click to drag, and that's going to rotate your light around. And what's cool is I can see how much there's a specular reflection difference, right? You can see that roughness is changing on this surface, so it has that really good information. Something I don't really like about it is, one, I don't really want this color variation quite that drastic, right? Because this is going to be my base layer. So I kind of breeze past this, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to build this up into two layers, right? Just like it is in real life, right? I want to make this base layer and try to build it to match this as close as I can, and then I'm going to make that top green layer, okay? So I'm going to go back down to Substance Painter. And so we're making that base layer. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to, oh no, I don't like that. I like the properties to be down here. This is my personal preference, and then the layers and texture set settings all up here. So I got my clay-based material. I'm just going to call this one, yeah, we'll keep it clay terracotta. And I can come down here. I have the different material channels it's affecting, so you can see it's affecting color. If I turn that off, it's not affecting color. It's affecting metalness. In this case, metalness by default is just off, so you can't see a difference. Here it's affecting height, right? So you can see it's the height information. And then it's affecting roughness, right? It's essentially breaking up the roughness. So whenever these little guys are highlighted, that's telling this fill layer. So this fill layer is filling this entire object up with these material properties, right? Just as if I was putting a material on an object in RenderMan, right? Is essentially I can control, let's go ahead and take a short step back. I'm going to drop a fill layer. So a fill layer, we're going to be using fill layers like 95% of the time. Sometimes we'll use paint layers, but paint layers are on a use case basis. I do not recommend using paint layers for most of your work. So a fill layer is literally just flooding your entire object with the material. So you can see we have our color, just like in Substance Paint or RenderMan. We have our color, which would be our diffuse color, right? I can open that up and change the color of my object. I have metallic, so remember in RenderMan we do it slightly different, right? Where we do like specular color and we affect the diffuse. Substance Painter is going to handle the metallic part for you. So you can see when I turn this metallic property up, right? Now it feels like gold, right? It's changing the specular and diffuse shading properties. And it's using base color as the color of the metal. So I'll just bring that metallic back down. Here's our roughness, right? That's going to be changing the, let's go ahead and make this a little bit darker. Okay, so roughness, this is going to change how glossy or rough my reflections are, right? Remember, lower the roughness, the sharper the reflections, the higher the roughness, the blurrier the reflections. So let's keep it down here. Normal, in this case, you're not going to adjust the normal. Do not change this color. If you need to plug in a map, that's totally cool. And then height. So this is just going to set a surface height. You'll notice my model's not changing, and that's because height is the perception, or in this case, height is like normal map, or a bump map. It's like the perception of differences in one height versus another. So where it changes height from one to the other, you're going to see like information or shading, right? But it's not actually moving the surface. If I swapped to displacement, so don't worry about this, but if I turned on displacement, let's go ahead and crank up displacement, and I came over here and turned up the height, you can see the surface is actually changing, right? But again, we're not going to worry about that. So I wouldn't recommend using height at this time and for this project. It's a little too much. So each fill layer is going to have that information, right? Now let's go ahead and I'm going to make a new fill layer. I'm going to click on this little fill icon up here to add another fill layer. And I'm going to go ahead and make this different. So let's go ahead and make this like, I'm going to go ahead and change the color to be yellow. I'm going to essentially make it look like gold. So we're going to make it metallic, fully metallic, and I'm going to make it a little glossier, shinier. Never going to set it to 0 and never going to set it to 1. So something a little bit like that. And I'm going to bring the height down a little bit. Okay. So right now, this whole layer right here is, and actually let's put this underneath. We're going to put this underneath. And yeah, we'll keep the height a little lower than the other layer. So I'll call this one top coat, and this one's going to be base. So I'm just renaming these. So if I take this top coat layer, you can see it just like in Photoshop and anywhere else that has a layering system, this top coat is completely covering the other material, right? It's almost like I wrapped this gold material in this like plasticky kind of urethane sort of coating, right? If I bring this opacity down, right, so each layer has opacity to it, you can see as I bring this opacity down, you'll notice the colors coming through, but it's not looking like it's metallic, right? And that's because if you expand this a little bit, right here, I'm looking at the layers settings for the base color only. So if we came over here and looked at just the base color, right? Let's change the slider from 100 to 0, right? It's essentially I'm turning off this layer's color. It's as if I came in here and just, let's go ahead and set this 100% and just turned off color, right? So it's just not color. But I can also do that with roughness. So we'll come over here to roughness, and now let's look at the roughness channel, right? If I come in here, like this top coat, if I look at it with the material, right, it's a little rough, and the gold has like almost no roughness. It's almost pure glossiness. So if I look at that roughness channel, you'll notice the top coat has a higher roughness, and the base channel has a lower roughness, right? Does that all make sense? Anybody confused so far? No? Okay, cool. All right, I'm going to press M to go back to material. So that's kind of how these fill layers work, right? The fill layers that I'm getting from Substance Painter over here, they're a lot like these fill layers, but they just have information built into them. So they have texture maps plugged into them. So these texture maps are already kind of modulating this in this fill layer. Usually these are created in like Substance Designer, so it has a lot more information just black boxed inside it, and you can't touch it or see it. But let's go ahead and go up here really quickly. Let's talk about masking. So most of our masking when we're working is going to be, or most of our texturing is going to go through the masking system. So everybody hopefully is familiar with the idea of masking, right? It's how you turn off one layer to show another layer underneath by specifying certain places, right? So we have, let's go back, I'm going to set this base color because it's easier to tell which layer is which. So we have our top coat, we have our base. I want to show the base in some areas, right? Like I want to rip off some of this top coat to show the layer underneath, the gold. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and right click on this layer and say add a white mask. So when I add a white mask, I always suggest looking at your masks. You can look at the mask for a layer by just holding Alt and clicking on the mask, and that just shows you in the viewport. You can see it switched to mask right here. So in here I have a white mask, and a white mask means that this layer is completely on, right? So white means 1, which is on, right? So when I have a white mask, it's showing. If I switch this and did a black mask instead, you can see if I look at this, it's 0 or black, and so none of the top coat is shown, right? So I'm going to go ahead and Alt click this, right click, and say add white mask. So we'll go back to white mask. Let's go ahead and right click on this mask and say add a paint layer. So we have like paint layer and fill layers out here on the material level, but we also have paint and fill layers in the mask level. So on this mask, I'm going to go ahead and add a paint layer. So we're just going to add a paint layer. And you'll see when you click on the paint layer, your tool over here already switches over to a paintbrush. And over here you can see I have the paintbrush selected by default. So you can see it's going to go paintbrush. We're not going to do a lot of paintbrush stuff. But I'm going to come down here to my color for my paintbrush and the properties, and I'm going to go ahead and paint black, right? So it's going to paint a black color. So I'm going to paint in this mask. And so you'll see wherever I paint black, I'm showing the layer underneath, and you get this really gross transition. If you hold Alt and click on this, you can see everywhere I painted black, right? We can see that that is now revealing the layer underneath or hiding the top coat, right? So wherever it's white or black in the mask, it's hiding the top layer. Where it's white, it's showing that current layer. Okay. I don't like how blurry fuzzy this edge is, and so you'll notice when I go in here, we have that weird transition period right there where it's like, The other thing is I want this surface to push up a little bit. So we're going to push this layer up a little bit. But it still looks a little strange, right? Like why is it kind of like welding there? The reason why is because we have this like blurry soft edge. I could have went to my brushes and switched to like a hard brush, right? I could have done like a really hard brush or changed the brush settings. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys the first filter we're going to care about. Or it's not really a filter, it's actually just a node by itself. So I'll right click in the mask and I'll say add levels. So when I do that, it adds a levels marker or adjuster. So a levels adjuster essentially is going to let me change my pixel values on this of the stuff below it, right? So it's taking that paint layer and it's essentially shifting and changing the values. If you want to make an image sharper, what you can do is you can take, this is called the input up here, input, and then this is output down here. We're not going to touch the output, we're only going to touch the input. So let's go ahead and really quickly, I'll show you guys a little bit what that's going to look like. So let's go ahead and add a grunge. Don't worry about copying what I'm doing right now. I just want to show you guys something that kind of, let's get let's not get a crowd. Let's do a fractal. Yeah, fractal. All right, so fractal. All right, so I did this just because it has a lot of grayscale values, right? It has black, white, and then it has some grayscale values. So I come over here, you can see this is showing a histogram, we'll talk about it another time, of the values of the layers below it, right? It's showing this fractal some pixel values. So these are black, how many pixels are black, here's how many are middle gray, here's how many white, you can see almost none of them are white. And you'll notice when I drag the middle, right, I'm shifting my image brighter or darker, right? So as I raise this middle gray value up, almost all those values are now getting pushed further and further into the dark region, right? Because this is the new middle gray up here. So closer to white, that means the darker this texture map is. If I bring the middle gray down lower, that means more and more of my pixel values are becoming brighter or higher than middle gray. Don't worry if that sounds confusing. This is just essentially moving this is going to adjust the overall look. This right here, if we bring the input down, I'm going to start increasing the contrast. So moving the input white and black points, the minimum and maximum, it's essentially going to increase our contrast. So as you bring them closer and closer, right, you can see this image got really, really sharp and high contrast. Okay. So what I can do is I can use that to sharpen my my edge, right? Because all these are just grayscale values in here. This is just gray, black, and white. And as I bring those input values closer, come on. So you'll see it's going to, as I bring them closer on the input, they get sharper. Let's go ahead and delete that layer. So I come out here, you can see that looks definitely better than it did before, right? Still doesn't look great, but you know, that looks pretty okay. And then I can come in here and you can see I just keep painting and it's already applying that levels node to it for me. So everything I'm painting is on this layer right here. Okay, so that's the basics of our structuring. And so this is where we're going to do a lot of our texturing, right? If I add a fill layer, not filter, add fill layer, and then I'm going to go ahead and go over here to my, they're not procedural textures, but they're kind of procedural textures. They're like, a lot of them are just tileable, some of them are procedural. But I'm going to say, let's get like a chippy, I'll see if there's anything that says chip. Grunge shavings. All right, it knew better for me. All right, so we're going to fill this. Let's turn off that levels, right? So we're going to look at this. So wherever it's white, it's showing this layer, right? So in this case, I want to invert this, right? I want to kind of have some areas where it's like ripped away, this top coat, right? So that it shows the metal. So right now, this isn't working. So I'm going to go ahead and usually have an invert button on them. And click on invert, right? So now it's hiding where those marks are. So you can see that now that's hiding or showing, you know, like based on this texture map, right? I'm getting this like black and white image. And I can use, again, that levels node to kind of change the grayscale values, right? Because I don't really want these like half committed texture maps right here, right? You see these guys? I don't really like those. So I'm going to go ahead and use that levels node to clamp my texture map. Maybe it's clamped a little too much. Let's go ahead and make that a little higher. And maybe I can just maybe like dial that back a little bit. But so we can see that there. So it looks good. All right. The other thing we want to look at when we do these texture fill nodes, right? So I did this with a fill node, right? Instead of a paint node or paint layer, I added a fill layer to my mask. And if you ever click on your material button, right, you'll see the mask collapse, but you have this orange that's telling me I have a lot more information in here. And to show that out, all I have to do is left click on this, and it shows me all my layers inside my mask. And again, holding Alt, clicking on my mask shows me my mask. I'm gonna come in here and I'm gonna make an adjustment to my grunge shavings. Let's say these are all too small, right? I want these to be bigger marks. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna come up here, and up here we can, if we're using a fill node, we can change a couple things about our fill node. The one that we're gonna talk about right now is our tiling. So tiling is essentially the size of your texture, right? If you bring this closer to 0, you'll see the texture map gets bigger and bigger and bigger, right? So it gets to be bigger markings, right? Until you get to 0, pretty much. And then it goes negative, which is just inverting it. And then if we go higher, you can see the texture map gets smaller and smaller, right? So if I look at it out here, right, and pressing M on my keyboard to go back to material, you can see I'm scaling and changing it as I'm going along. So that's one of the most important things we're going to have to worry about with our fill layers, with our textures, is just scaling it. You can also rotate it, right? So if you want to rotate it or offset it and position it differently, you can do that too. The other thing that might be important, in this case, there's only really one area we might see this. So I'm going to turn off that levels for a second. And we're going to switch this with something that has a little bit more grayscale value. So I'm just going to, again, put in like black and white dots or something. You'll notice anywhere, there's some texture stretching, that's gross. Anywhere where there's a texture seam, right, like essentially UV unwrapping seam, right? So if I go over here and you can click on this right here, this shows 3D view only. If you click on it, I can see 2D view only, right? You can see right here is where our teapot is cut off from the spout. So there's a cut on our texture map between the body and the spout, which is probably this thing, or I don't know where it is. And you can see I can move my texture map in here as well. And so you'll see this texture map is being laid out in the UV. So you'll see this mark right here. You see how it like spans from here to here. That's going to create a texture seam, right? Because they're not actually physically touching, right? So there's going to be a gap on my texture map. So if I go back to 3D view, 3D only, that's what's causing this, right? It's that the texture maps isn't touching those two parts of the model on the UV map. That's a gross simplification. So the other thing that you're going to want to worry about a lot of times is called changing our projection. So right now we're using the most common one that you guys are all familiar with, which when you use texture maps, which is UVs, right? You're laying out your texture map on the UVs, and the UV map is essentially mapping a flat surface onto a 3D model. So if I come over here and I click on this and click to triplanar projection, what this does is you'll notice it's not having any of that texture seam issue, right? We're getting stretching, which is actually just a problem of the UVs were not done great. But you'll notice we're not getting a seam issue. And that's because it's not laying it out based on the UVs. It's actually projecting it in 3D space. All right. I'm realizing I'm quickly running out of time. No, when we export our texture maps, they are going to go back down to UV. So same thing with painting. Anything we do in 3D is going to be baked down to 2D. So my recommendation is if you're going to be using any of these like procedural or tileable texture maps from here, I almost always switch over to triplanar, right? Projection, because then I don't have to worry about texture seams. There's some instances where you wouldn't want to do that. So for instance, triplanar doesn't work great with regular patterns. So if I came in here and I did, I don't know, like let's try this thing. So let's go ahead and I'm going to tile it up. Oh, actually, this turned out surprisingly good. I don't like that. I want it to look bad. Let's see. We'll do this one. Bricks. All right, so you can kind of see it right there, right? There's going to be like seams in the projection for any pattern things. That's where it like kind of becomes noticeably like where it blends the texture projections because it's projecting it from 6 different directions and blending it. And you can see that hardness for the blending, right? If I bring that down to 0 or bring it up to 1, right? It's like that softness or hardness of that blend. And then I might use some other different projections, like I might use like a cylindrical projection, which works on some areas, right? You can see on the body it works perfectly, but in other areas, obviously like the spout and the top, it looks really weird. So now it's like wrapping that texture map like a cylinder. I could do spherical, I could do all kinds of ones. So anyways, we're not going to worry about that because we're not going to use any regularly patterned images. But either way, so it's just a matter of taking the texture map inside of Substance and applying it to your model. But when you guys export it out of Substance Painter, it's going to bake it all down to UV texture maps for you, so you don't have to think about it. All right. So let's continue. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to go back to, so that's like showing us like the base level. Everything's awesome. Cool, cool, cool. All right, so let's come up to terracotta. And I'm going to go ahead and make some adjustments to this. First, I'm going to go ahead and add a fill layer. So this fill layer is going to be used. Actually, before I do that, let's go ahead and come down here to the height. And I'll go over to my height channel in the layer stack. And I'm going to bring the value of the height down lower. So I'm just going to go ahead and start from 0 and push it up. So let's see. Let's see how much it's affecting it. Let's see. Height. Okay, so I want it really subtle. So I'm almost bring it down to 0. So you can see now that that height is like barely catching. It's barely raising up. Okay. All right, color. So I'm going to go ahead and use this fill layer right here. And I only want it to affect color. So I'm going to go ahead and hold, you can click off all the metal, roughness, normal, and height. So it's only affecting color. Another thing you can do is if you just hold Alt and click on a single color channel, it isolates that color channel or material channel. So I hold Alt and press color. This fill layer, I'm going to name it. We're going to say base color. Is going to give me my color. I like the color of the other one. I'm just going to go ahead and try to like bring it closer together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and click on this little sample color right here, this little dropper, and I'm just going to pick like this color I like right here, and then go ahead and turn on that layer. So you can see it kind of set it to that color. And if I have the image up, right, so in this case it's like a little purplier, so maybe we're going to take this and we're going to kind of bring it a little bit cooler, so closer to like something like this. But let's go ahead and bring it, yeah, something like that, right? So it's like down here. I'm going to desaturate it quite a bit, right? I don't want it to be so red. So look at my image, and it could be a little bit darker, but I think that's good enough for now. And what's nice is I can come over here to my color. So let's go back to our color, and we want some of that color variation from the original. That's kind of nice, the terracotta layer. So I'm just going to bring the opacity down a little bit. So you can see I'm still getting a little bit of color in here, but it's not like overpoweringly high contrast. Cool. All right, and I also get this really awesome roughness breakup. All right, so let's go ahead and look at our reference. Now we're going to go ahead and try to get some markings. So the unfortunate thing is I don't have a lot of information revealed on this layer, but I do see there's like a general roughness. So I'm going to try to set a general roughness for my this layer. So you can see it's pretty constant. And then I also have these little bumpy guys. So I'll try to find a texture map to get some bumpy irregular shapes to break this up. All right, so my roughness, let's go ahead and I'm going to turn on roughness. And again, I'm going to go ahead and go to the roughness channel, and we're going to go ahead and bring this down to 0, and we'll dial it up a little bit. So that's just going to, if I look at my roughness channel, right? So essentially, if this was at 100, right, we have just a constant roughness, which is why it looks really flat and boring, right? But if I go back over and just look, I'm pressing C on my keyboard to look at my roughness channel again. If I bring that opacity down, I can get still get some of that information from the layer below, right? So it has some breakup, but it's not, you know, it's a little bit more controllable. All right, so let's go ahead and add those kind of bumpy patterns. So I'm going to add a new fill layer. I'm going to call this one bumpy underscore height, right? So it's going to give me some of those bumpy patterns. And I'm going to go ahead and let's switch this over to base color again. I like to, if I'm not editing any of my like separate material channels, I like to just sit in the base color just because it's easy at a glance to tell, like, oh yeah, that's that one color layer, because color is easier to think of instead of roughness and height and all that stuff. So anyways, it doesn't matter. So bumpy height, this one I want to only affect height, so I'm going to hold Alt and click on height. I want to go ahead and give it a little bit of height, so just pull it up a little bit, and we'll probably dial it back in a second. And I'm going to go ahead and add a black mask. So we have a black mask, and so now we're going to, because we're going to add a texture to this, so it's not constant everywhere, right? So we have some variation in this layer. So some areas get bumpier and some areas don't get bumpier. So we're going to need a texture map. I'll right-click this black mask, and I'm going to say add a fill layer. And now right here in this fill layer, we can attach a texture image right here. So I'm going to go over to my textures, and I'm going to find, usually for this kind of stuff, I would use grunge, right? The grunge maps are like a lot of very organic image-based stuff. So they're like kind of things like water drippings or splotches or some kind of like stone pattern, right? So they're a little bit more like organic, which is great for triplanar projection. So let's go ahead and switch this to triplanar for now. And if you don't like this display of this like cube whenever you're on triplanar, you just click this button right here, show hide projection manipulator. I could just hide that. So let's go ahead and find something that looks, this button right here. It's this little button right here. No worries. So if you hate that, because I do, you know, you just click that to just hide it. So I'm looking through these, and there's like I'm already kind of seeing one that I kind of like, which is Grunge Pebbles Dirt. I think that one's pretty cool. There's a lot of really cool ones here that we can like continue to make this look good. But let's go ahead and start with Grunge Pebbles Dirt. So I'll do that. So you can see already I'm getting kind of like this pebbly, bumpy surface that kind of reminds me a bit of like this area right here, right? So that's already out the gate, like looking pretty good. If I hold Alt and click on this, we're going to see just this layer. So it's a really cool map, right? So you can see it's got this really, really interesting texture that you couldn't create just from patterns. Usually this is based on an image. If I bring this tiling up, you'll see that it starts to repeat. And if I change this hardness, right, you can see this transition between each layers. It's tileable, so you're not going to actually see the transition, right? But let's go ahead and bring that tiling back to like 1. I actually think that's like almost perfect. And then one thing I don't really like is I don't want this everywhere, right? You can see it just becomes bumpy everywhere. I want this to be a little bit more like lost and found. And you guys will hear me say this term a lot, lost and found. Lost and found essentially means that when you apply a texture map or something or an effect, it's not everywhere equally, right? You have some areas where you lose it, somewhere where you find it. And you'll see that in any texture, right? Like take for instance like this bumpy pattern on this base layer. You'll see it's lost right here. We don't see bumpiness. It's very smooth up here, but down here it's very bumpy, right? This color orange, right? This yellowy kind of color orange, right? We see it here, but most of the other areas we have this like blue green, and then we get this like kind of brown orange over here too, right? So that's lost and found. It makes things look more believable and realistic instead of just like this equal pattern across the whole model. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to Substance Painter. In order to do lost and found, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take another map and I'm going to use it to hide this map. So I'm going to add a new fill layer in this mask by right-clicking and saying add fill. So you can see it's completely covering the layer. And then I'm going to look for something that has a high contrast black and white information. It doesn't have to have high contrast. Actually, I'll probably look for something maybe, we'll try something. It helps to just try stuff. Like I'll try things and just back off and be like, that looks stupid. But we're going to go do this. Again, we're going to switch it to triplanar projection. Let's scale it down. It's a little big, but it's kind of cool looking. If I came out here, you can see this is kind of a cool map, right? So that's what this one looks like. And maybe we wanted to use this one. But in this case, I still want to use this one, but it's everywhere. So in order to get these to combine together, though, just like in Photoshop, the default layer behavior is one layer just covers the other layer. Whatever is on top of the layer stack, so this is layer stack, the lower layer, upper layer, essentially just sits on top of each other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a blending mode. So you'll see these like little, on any of these layers it says normal. Normal just means it's just a normal layer behavior. It just sits on top of the other one and covers the other one. But we can change this to do a blending mode. So there's videos and links on the on Canvas. I recommend you guys go look at Canvas. I can show you guys a link later. But actually, Substance Painter has like an amazing blending modes tutorial. It's like 20 minutes. I recommend everybody watch it. If you guys do not understand blending modes, you're missing out completely on texturing. I will guarantee you're not going to be good at 3D texturing if you do not understand blending modes. They're not hard, it's just understanding like what each mode does when it combines these maps together. Because when you use a blending mode, what it does is actually takes the current layer and starts integrating it with the layer below. Like it starts adding them, subtracting them, multiplying them together. So in this case, multiply, through my experience with Photoshop, I know that multiply is going to take all of my black pixel values here and it's going to darken the image below. And all the white pixel values it's just going to ignore on this layer. So as it's switched to multiply, you can see all those dark pixels are being added to or multiplied on the layer below and hiding them. So multiply, whenever I'm using like if I want to do lost and found, I'm usually using multiply to lose stuff, and I use screen to add stuff. So screen is going to take all the white values and add them. So if I went to screen, right, you can see all the white values are now being added to the layer below instead of the black values. So in this case, I want to hide things though, so I'm doing multiply. So now you can see that adds a little bit of like lost and found. Some areas you see the bumpy pattern more clearly, in other areas you don't. Cool. All right. Let's, on this layer, it doesn't always feel believable if a single layer only affects one attribute, right? So if you have a layer that does height, but that height layer isn't affecting your roughness or your color in some way, usually it feels a little one-dimensional, right? So in this case, I'm going to go back to my material by clicking on the bumpy height layer, and I'm going to give a little roughness variation to it. So I'm going to go ahead and click on rough, and I'm going to go over to the roughness. And now that we know about, what's it called? Blending modes, right? I can go ahead and go to, let's go ahead and look at that roughness channel. So I'll turn this on and off. You can see it's now modulating my layer below, but I can go ahead and sometimes what it's doing is it's overriding the layer below wherever this mask is showing. So wherever it's showing this mask right here, whenever I look at this roughness channel, you can see it's overriding the information below. I usually don't like my roughness to just sit on top of everything else and cover it unless I need to. I usually like it to kind of, again, mix with the layers below. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and let it multiply. If you're ever in doubt, you want it to darken and lighten, but you don't know which, you can do overlay. Overlay darkens and lightens. That's a blending mode that just takes white and black values and adds them to the lower layer. I'm simplifying these things, so maybe we do a little overlaying. So that's going to combine with the layer below, right? And if I come out here, we're going to go ahead and adjust that roughness value. So, if I make it rougher, you can see all those kind of raised bumpies become rougher. Or if I want them to be glossier, which is kind of cool. I like them kind of glossier. You can see those little pebbly hits are picking up more light reflection. Cool. And let's add just a little color. And I'm just going to go ahead and set the color. So let's go to color, base color. I'm going to set that color really, really, really low. I just want it to be just slightly present, right? Cool. All right. So one last thing I'm going to do on this is I got some roughness breakup. I have some height breakup. This is all a good spot. I usually do like multiple layers. I don't just use one texture map. So I might do another breakup where I do like some holes. But just for the interest of time, let's do color breakup. So I'm going to go ahead and add another fill layer. So we're going to click on this fill layer icon. We're going to name this one color breakup. Okay. Always name your layers. If you guys you don't have to name your mask layers. You can if you want to. But always name your layers. If you do not, I guarantee you open your file the next day and you spend a good like 15 minutes just figuring out how your materials work. So color breakup. This one's only going to be affecting color. I just want to kind of get some like color variation here, and I might have a couple layers. Like I might do this one like a little bit of yellow. So let's go ahead and set this color to like a yellowy color. So we add that, you can see it just completely overrides it. So I'm going to bring this opacity down a little bit, right? And again, I could change the blending mode so it integrates with it. So maybe I do something like soft light or hard light. You can experiment. I don't expect you guys to know every blending mode out of the box. Sometimes you just go through them to understand, see what they do, right? So you can see this kind of adds a little bit of saturation, yellowness to it. So obviously we don't want it to be everywhere. So we're going to add a black mask. I'm going to add a fill to this layer. And to this mask. And so now I'm going to go ahead and for this kind of stuff, like a really hazy kind of look, I want this to be really subtle. So I'm not going to use something that's like super high contrast like this one. I might. It depends on what my texture map calls or my reference calls for. But I might go for something a little bit more like kind of smudgy, or I mean, we might just search smudge. So there's all these like really great smudgy textures, right? Let's do like this one. And this is really low res. You can see how low res it is just because it's being scaled up too much. Again, we're going to do triplanar, and we might scale it down or up, but I think right now it looks pretty good. So let's just turn that on. Just very subtle. Let's set it back to normal so we see it a little bit more prominently, and we're just going to dial the color down a little bit. Right now, so what's cool is I can use that levels node. So if we come over here, I can use that levels node to adjust this texture map. So that's a great thing about the how Substance works and how levels work, and understanding how levels nodes work and how blending modes work is that you can adjust these maps to be non-default. So this is what the default map looks like, but I can use a levels node to like make it kind of like a texture map like this. Let's go ahead and set this up higher, right? So it's like almost becomes a completely different texture map when you adjust these values, right? Now I get these like cool little splotchy details, like almost like, I don't know, it's just yellow, so it feels like sickness to me. Or I can like make this spread wider, right? Like a very soft, dusty kind of texture, right? So you can see it can completely change what that texture maps looks like. Pro tip, use levels node at the beginning, but eventually what you can do is on these, they have a balance and contrast node, which is actually pretty much doing what levels does for you. Balance is like changing that gray slider on the levels node. So it's just pushing it higher and lower. And then contrast is sharpening the details, like bringing the inputs closer. So you can use that to like clamp details off, right? If I want only a little bit of these splotchies, or I want only a little bit of the layer underneath. Cool. Let's just bring that all down. But I'll go ahead and use that this guy a little bit. I actually kind of just like it how it is. So I'm just going to go ahead and bring the opacity down a little bit. And let's go ahead and in this case, I'll do like color or hue. Let's do hue. Oh, saturation. No, let's just do color. Yeah, bring it up a little bit. So we'll just do like a little bit like that. In this case, I'm going to duplicate this layer, right? Because I'm going to do essentially the same effect, right? This case, I might add like a little bit of green, blue, some cooler tones, maybe a little less saturated than that. So let's bring it a little bit greener. And then what I'm going to do is I need to change up this texture map, right? So I might get a different kind of shape or texture map. Again, this should be based on my reference, but in the interest of time and because we can't see a lot of the lower layer, I'm going to go ahead and kind of like make assumptions or just make something that looks pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and do this layer. This one has some interesting patterns. It looks a little inorganic, so right, if we look at this, that doesn't look very organic. So I'm going to go ahead and not use that one. So, play around with it. I go through and cycle through these all the time. I'll be like, oh man, I remember one that looked really good from so long ago. And it was yesterday that I was using it, but I just completely forgot it. That one's cool. And sometimes you'll get ideas for later. Be like, oh man, I'm going to definitely use that later for a different layer. This one looks pretty good. Oh, okay, this is my favorite one. I always use this one, galvanized. It just looks so cool. And it adds this like really interesting breakup pattern. And so I'm actually going to use this one just because I'm a big fan of it. Dear Galvanized, big fan. So I'll maybe bring that a little bit larger. And then in this case, that color is like a little too regular, right? So it's just a little too regular, like my yellow and my blues are happening too regularly. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and add in another fill layer and to do some lost and found. So we're going to use like a high contrast map like this. Let's go ahead and triplanar it. So triplanar. We'll bring these shapes up a little bit, bring that hardness really low so we don't get like an edge right there. And I'm going to multiply it on top so that the black values subtract out from the lower values right there. Becomes a little too high contrast, but that's okay. So that's a little bit more localized. And maybe in this case, I also want this to affect the roughness a little bit. It's always a good idea to have color breakup layers to also affect the roughness a little bit. So in this case, let's go ahead and turn on roughness. So we go here. Let's turn off the color just so we can see the effect that the roughness has. So you can see it has this like roughness breakup right there. Boop, boop. So that's cool. So I'm going to add that, and I might do that a little bit on the yellow layer. But you can see like now we're getting a lot of interesting information. And so class ends at 2. Okay, cool. So we can go a little bit further. And a lot of times I'm going to go back and be like, oh, I don't like that, and completely change things. But anyways, so we're going to keep this. We're going to always come back to this layer. Oh, actually, let's go ahead and do this. So we're not going to see it in the image, right? We'll see it way more on that top layer, right? Like you can see it here, right? You're getting like that orange stuff and this like green mark. So most of the time you're going to have material properties that are being affected actually by the surface of the object, right? So in the case of this up here, right, because of that handle touching the body, right, in some ways that corrosion effect is actually being enhanced, or it's because it's being blocked by the sun because this casts a shadow on it, whatever. You'll usually see this kind of differentiation in certain parts of your model that's based on the surface of the model. If I look at some of the other examples, let's see, shading. Hopefully I have a couple other ones in here. Details where? Nah, not that one. Let's go back. A2, I don't have any other images. I just don't want to open up, the thing, Chrome. Okay, I'll just use it. Oh, this is terrible. Let's do this. Nope, these are all really, really bad. They're really small. This was for like assignment 6. Okay, this shows you some examples, right? Like there is, for instance, these pieces right here have a lot more interaction with other objects, right? Like you can see these wheels, these treads on this whatever tanker thing, something. These teeth are going into the tread and they're pulling the tread, right? So you're getting metal scraping against metal. So if you look at this, on these like tread pieces, there's going to be a lot more interaction, a lot more wear. And this outer piece that's not touching it, you can see that has way less wear, right? This area right here, again, like it's kind of pointing up and facing up, and it's also hidden. So maybe there's a lot of dust and dirt that gets collected on here. These vertical surfaces, dust isn't allowed to like kind of like sit on it, right? Because they're vertical, right? So it slides off. So anything that's like facing up is going to generally pick up a lot more dust and dirt, right? If you guys go and look at like a room that's barely been used in your house, you'll notice obviously all the surfaces that point up towards the sky are going to be dusty, but anything that's pointing forward or down is going to get a lot less dust, right? So it's important to understand like how the details and the location of the surfaces are affecting your texturing map too, right? Look at this paint right here. You can see it's like pretty constant in here, right? It has some irregularities, but on that edge, right, that edges are always more likely to get touched or interacted with than flat surfaces, just pro tip. So this edge, is getting beaten up over the years, right? Something dings into it, something runs into it, and so you're getting that. There's also kind of like this chipping and wearing away from this edge for different reasons, but we don't have to worry about that right now. You don't always have to know why it's doing that, but it's important to have reference in observing when it's happening and where it's happening. So I don't necessarily know why this peels here, like specifically, but I'm noticing, hey, along this edge, it's going to peel up. So those kinds of things are going to be really important. You can see right here on this lip of this vase, you can see pure metal is being shown, right? Because again, that lip is going to be where like the crust is most likely to be chipped away or hit by something, right? So that's where we see a lot more of that rust. Anyways, going back to painting. So in order to, so it's nice to take a break, and look away. I'm gonna bring these down to like 10% just because I feel like they're a little too obvious. There we go. Okay, and so if we got rid of those, you can see how flat that looks. Anyways, cool. Let's go ahead and I'm just gonna show you guys like maybe it picks up a little bit more dirt right here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and we have to rename this one to green. All right, I'm going to go ahead and add a new fill layer. Or actually, let's go ahead and you can use some of these presets. Like you don't have to use it just for the base. You can kind of take some of these to use as like a layer. In this case, let's go ahead and grab all of this stuff. We're going to go ahead and put it in a folder. So you can press Control G to take all of your selected layers and put them in a folder, right? And so all of these, okay, cool, that looks fine. All of these are now going to be my under layer. Or base, let's call it the base layer. Base layer. Or base material, let's call it that. Base material. Actually, I'm just kidding. Base material. So this whole folder is going to contain my base material. So this is going to help me organize. As I like start adding on other materials, like I want the outer layer, or I want some rust or anything like that, I can start layering them on top and I know where to like, because they're very different, like they're kind of treated differently, right? So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and add a new material. And let's just go ahead and drag from here. I'm going to add in like a rust material. And let's go ahead and let's go to rust. They used to have a really good rust one. Fine rust. Okay. I guess I got rid of it maybe. So I'm just going to add this rust material. And I'm going to have to change the color a lot, but you can see this is really, really cool. That color doesn't make any sense, but super rough. I might come in here, let's again change that to triplanar, and we're actually, that tiling looks a lot better now. But obviously I don't want this everywhere. So again, I'm going to take this and add a black mask. Now let's add a fill. And in this layer, what I'm going to do is now we're going to use one of these smart masks. So you can use like edge detection, curvature, ambient occlusion, all that stuff using what's called generators. But for right now, don't worry about that. I would just use smart masks. So I'm going to find something that represents like what I want, right? So in this case, I want dirt, cavity, rust, right? So cavity rust, perfect. I want this to show up in the cavities, right? I'm going to click and drag this onto this mask. And now, once it processes, you can see that's now having an effect only on these cavity areas, right? It's using, if I alt click on this, you can see it's using that, let's look at this mesh map. If I look at my ambient occlusion, right? It's using this map and plus a texture map to give me this cool look. So press M. All right, I'm gonna have to edit it, so you can see it doesn't look great right there, which actually might be something I don't know if I can edit. But, and we're not gonna go too far into like, how to do these mask editor generators, but I'm probably gonna come into the ambient occlusion and it's probably in the curvature. I'm gonna go ahead and use these larger values. And this is getting a little slow. So if it gets a little too slow, then just you might want to drop your resolution to like 2K. All right, this is going to take a lot of playing around with. Let's see, ambient occlusion, balance. All right, so that's disappearing. Let's go ahead and bring it up. So let's do something like that. And then what I can do is it's too regular again, so we're going to add a fill node. And so if we're looking at this, we're adding a fill node. And then I'm going to, again, do some breakup on it. So let's go ahead and just do some general breakup. I'm just going to choose something for speed reasons. We're going to go ahead and do triplanar. We're going to multiply. So it combines with the layer below. And I'm going to go ahead and bring the tiling a little lower and then use the balance to control that a little bit better. Maybe some contrast. And so that looks a little gross, but maybe we add a little blurring to it. But you can see that's how I would totally 1000% keep playing with this because this looks awful. And actually for this layer, let's go ahead and, if you ever use one of these layers, you can come down here to technical parameters to change the height range. So in this case, this height range is a little too high, so I'm going to go ahead and bring it down a little bit. So it kind of sits on top of it a little bit more gently. So that can help, like control that, any of those layers where you don't have full control of all the elements, but you like what it looks like. Cool. Any questions? So next class, I'll continue with this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to build that top layer, and we're going to start worrying about, and I'll try to show you guys some other things like including anchor points, which are super important. So in the meantime, I recommend if you guys weren't able to do it in class, go ahead and do this, get to this stage, so that you guys can follow along with it tomorrow or Thursday in class, because this is what you're going to have to do for all on your own for the other materials. Okay? Cool. All right. Other than that, I think you guys are good to go. Let's go ahead and save this file, save as A2.
Upload that recording.
Yeah. Let me go ahead and stop the recording now.